Hi, St. John's. The Gospels tell us the story about Jesus inviting a tax collector named Levi, also known as Matthew, to become one of his disciples. And in the story, the way Luke tells it, Jesus says to this guy, Levi, he says to him, right as he's collecting taxes, and the people really felt like tax collectors were some of the worst in society because they were colluding with the Roman oppressors, even though they themselves were Jews. So we're told that Jesus comes up to Matthew and he looks at him and he says, I want you to follow me. And Matthew drops everything and he is so excited that he goes and he throws this big party, invites all of his friends to come just to celebrate Jesus. And Jesus and his disciples are in Matthew's home. And the Pharisees and the scribes, the religious people in the day, they come up and they are really critical of Jesus. And they just can't believe what they're seeing. Here's this rabbi who is a respected rabbi. This is at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, talking about God and talking about, religion and the scriptures. But he's sitting in the home of a tax collector and he is just eating, hanging out like there's nothing wrong. He's not condemning. And so the Pharisees and the scribes are extremely critical and they say to the disciples, what is going on? Why would your master eat with all these sinners? And Jesus responds and he says, listen, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick. And he says, I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Now, when you really think about this story, as wonderful as it is, and we love to think about the warm fuzzies it gives us that Jesus is all encompassing and all welcoming. When you really think about that Jesus is picking disciples and there's only going to be 12, and you think of the character of some of these individuals that he picks to be his disciples, you really have to call that into question. Why go to someone in the society, in the community, who is seen as a traitor, who is seen as truly abusive, someone who lines his own pockets with money as he collects for the Roman oppressors? Why would Jesus do that? You have to wonder about Jesus' judgment here. Then there's this other story. If you fast forward in the Gospel of Luke, you get to the story where Jesus is giving a parable and he talks about two people going to pray. One of them is a tax collector and the other is a Pharisee. And the Pharisee goes first and he is just like, God, I thank you that I am such a wonderful person. I thank you that I tithe, on my income and I fast every week. And then he looks over and he sees a tax collector and he says, and I thank you that I'm not like this tax collector, that I'm better than him. And then Jesus says the tax collector prays, and all he does is he looks down at the ground and he just beats his chest and he says, God, please forgive me, for I'm a sinner. And Jesus says, of the two, which one do you think went home justified? And in Jesus's story, in his parable, in his worldview, it's the tax collector that goes home justified. So it's not the person who got it right, who's celebrating all of his rightness and his goodness. It's the person who actually gets it wrong. I heard Richard Rohr in the last few days say something so powerful. He said, we come to God by getting it wrong, not by getting it right. What do you think about that? We come to God by getting it wrong, not by getting it right. I wonder how this quote that is very much consistent and in line with what we find in the Gospels about Jesus and Jesus's worldview. I wonder how that influences and corrects in some ways how we think of mistakes and our shortcomings and what we think of religion and kind of what the point of religion is. Is it about getting it right? I also think about people who might hear a quote like that and say, great, we can just go and do everything wrong that we want to. We don't have to, we can sin all we want to. We can hurt people. We can do things that hurt ourselves. And that's actually going to get us closer to God. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because it kind of sounds ridiculous. And Paul actually addresses that kind of attitude in Romans. But here the point is this very pastoral message about a God who sees us in our humanity and sees that our humanity is just fundamentally about actually getting it wrong so often that most of the time we don't sit at the top of the mountain saying, yes, I feel great about myself. I feel like I've made all the right decisions. But no, most of the time it's us waking up in the middle of the night, wrestling with the decisions and the words and the actions that we've made that fell short of what we really wish we had said or done. And so I love this theology that we come to God by getting it wrong, not by getting it right. This idea that when we get things wrong, when there's conflict, when there's brokenness in relationship, that's actually where we tend to be most vulnerable and most honest. And it's these qualities that lend themselves most to a closer and more intimate relationship. So in that sense, conflict is not a bad thing when we get things wrong in relationship. But actually if we work through them right and we really listen to one another, it leads to deeper intimacy. And so I hope today as you hear this message, maybe there's a slight flip for you in the way that you are thinking of the things that you may have fallen short in the last week or 2 weeks, or maybe bigger things that you consider yourself maybe a failure at. Just to hold on to this truth that we find in the Gospels, this portal to something better, to closeness with God and with others, when we realize that it's actually our shortcomings, not our perfection, that deepens intimacy. God bless you, St. John's. I look forward to seeing you on Sunday.